Okay, let's start the conversation. Maybe you want to introduce why you reached out to me to have this conversation.
Okay, so my name is Nia McCash. I am a ServiceNow architect at the University of Toronto Mississauga in Canada. I help look after kind of our platform and our instance, and part of my job is to review some of the development that gets put into the platform, whether that's be by other developers that are contributing stories and functionalities. And we also have a set of citizen developers that contribute. They are from our Office of the Registrar, so they're not part of the core IT team, but they are pro developers. They're very experienced full stack PHP developers. That's their background. They learned ServiceNow and they built their own app suite, which won the Devies in 2023. But that app, they build it and it's coming onto our platform, which means it's my responsibility to review their dev work and make sure that everything follows ServiceNow recommendations and best practices, doesn't break any other functionality that might be shared globally, that kind of thing. So that's part of a big part of my role and a big part of my job. I reached out to you because I know that as part of the Hack for Good that you were quite involved in, it was an interesting initiative because I was curious to know, what did the stories look like? Can you provide some examples on how it worked? Because it feels to me like it was a giant citizen development kind of initiative in some ways. You had people who were not part of, whatever platform team or app team that supports this app contributing development and configuration as part of this app. So what did the stories look like? What did the output of the contributors look like? For example, there are many ways that you can accomplish something in ServiceNow. I mean, you can script something as a business rule entirely, or you can make it as a flow. So did the stories specify? If not, like how do you make sure that they did it the way that you wanted the app to do it, and in a way that was kind of maintainable, followed best practices, that kind of thing?
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting topic. And to give you a bit of background, we were asked by ServiceNow to support the initiative at Hack for Good, where we helped build an app to connect coaches, volunteers, with female or girl developers all across the world to empower them. I'm very fortunate to work in a company where your gender does not play a role in whether or not you get the opportunities. But there are countries where, as a female or as a girl, it's harder to one, recognize that you can be a developer, and two, there's a lot more hurdles that you need to take. So having the right mentor or coach is key. So of course we from Platformation said yes, we are going to support. I was involved, but I have to give a lot of credits to Michelle Slater. She's also an architect, so we were the two architects involved, but she really did a major part in the high-level design. And to dive a bit in your question, how did we go about this topic? It's sort of, we already knew when we heard about the initiative, it's going to be chaos, and how can we make it a bit more organized chaos? We also had in the back of our mind that it's Hack for Good, sort of hackathon style initiative. So to connect to your question on the guidance and the prescriptiveness of that guidance, we wanted to give the flexibility and have a developer not per se going into low code, no code if they want to go the pro code route or vice versa. So we did not prescribe whether you could do it with a flow or a business rule. Really that filling in the details, having the creativity was up to the candidate, which we knew will add to the chaos, which also indeed, if you look at the results, was indeed. We had sometimes different rounds addressing the same story in different ways. So it was interesting to see a lot of creativity. So that was the flexibility on a story level. But what we did, what actually Michelle did, she did create a high-level design, a phased approach, and it's like, hey, it connects. There's dependency between this story and the other, that we also wanted the developers working on it to understand, okay, it's part of a bigger app. So in that sense, you can be creative, but it should fit into the high-level design. What we also did, you talked about the pro coders, app winners. We have a lot of experienced developers that joined us, and also less experienced developers, maybe a customer that might be interested. So we classified the stories with just a simple 1, 2, or 3. 3, difficulty level, where we said, okay, this is probably a more complex story. We really want somebody that understands the nuance when to use a flow and when to use a business rule. So we classify it as a more challenging story, a 3. Whereas if it's just a simple catalog item or adding some questions to a portal, that can be a 1. So that's a bit on the guiding principles, but a lot of it was really not prescriptive. And that's also the fun thing. That's why we were there present at Vegas as well, right? Because sometimes you see, for some developers, it was really their first hackathon, and they were used to really prescriptive stories. And then you get a almost very vague story in front of you. And it's like, yeah, it's up to you as an expert or with your expertise to come up with a solution for this. And after many of the sessions, people came back to us and said, yeah, I really appreciate it being put on the spot like that, having to think for myself with less boundaries than they were used to. The other side of the coin means that there is a bit more work after the fact, right? You have different developers, different styles, different solutions that might not work better together. If you have a flow and you would like a subflow, but instead that piece was built in a business rule, yeah, that takes a bit of rework. But luckily, we have a whole team that is going through the environment, looking what is built. We still want to safeguard many of the creative solutions, but whether if that creative solution was built as a business rule and we rebuild it as a subflow, we try to make it more efficient, more streamlined, and work as one app. So that's a bit of the rework that's happening currently. And the coming week, we have a hackathon in India where they also have at least 2 teams working on this, building it out, making it future-proof. So those are a bit of the mechanisms that we utilized.
That's very cool. I like that the rating of 1 to 3 in terms of difficulty, so a variety of kind of experiences could participate. And it's interesting to know what happens afterwards. And you talked about you're having a team kind of go through what's been built and review it and things like that. I am curious because at one point I believe you said you had different kind of rounds try and tackle the same stories. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the mechanisms on how you did that? Like, was everybody working on the same instance? Were they submitting, pull requests to a code repository? How did that work?
Yeah, this is a good question. Here again, we had to balance the outcome to also the fun we wanted to have and the sort of the accessibility of the exercise, because you have people that are not experienced at all. Mm-hmm. So we said 1 instance, 1 scope. People don't have to worry about scope, don't have to worry about submitting code, which again adds to the chaos, but makes it a lot more easier for people that really just start in ServiceNow, had some experience to experiment. What we did in between the rounds is review as much as we could, of course. Time is limited. You've been to knowledge as well, so it's also being lived there. It's always things going on. But a good example for that is after day 1, and there I have to really shout out to Tim, one of my colleagues, and Jeroen and Shivesh. The 4 of us sitting in one of the cafes with our laptops, going through the stories, reviewing, also enhancing the stories, because we said, hey, if a lot of the text is maybe misinterpreted day 1, let's see what we can improve in the other rounds, because we did have rounds building up onto each other. So sometimes that meant already putting some things in place for others to have the dependency taken care of in round 2 and 3. And other times that just meant a bit of rewording, that we say, hey, maybe clarify wave 2 or 3 a bit more. And that was really up until the point that the people working at the cafe started cleaning up right next to us, hinting that we should really go, right? So that was a long evening, but it definitely paid off. I think the response on day 2 and 3 on the stories, the clarity that it provided was also well received.
Wow, that's fantastic work and seems like monumental effort. Good job on you and your team. Curious to know kind of a technical intricacy again. How did you know what was contributed? Like, were you looking, what records were you looking at, update sets, or did people, log in with their own credentials, and so you could see all the records created by a certain login were the ones that were contributed? How did that work?
Yeah, exactly. So we didn't bother too much with the update sets, because you also run the risk, even if we set up that mechanism, if people misinterpret that, start working in the global scope, in the default update set, you still want to see those updates. So we are just checking that the standard tricks of the updated by, going through the code. And of course, we have that high level design. So we checked the places where we at least expected the solutions. But you can imagine, sometimes we looked in the expected places, could not find anything. And during the day, of course, the stories were updated. So we knew that the developers at least said, hey, this story is ready. So if they said something was built and we couldn't find it in the regular places, then a bit of investigation was needed. As I said, we were sometimes really surprised on the creative solutions. So those are a few things. And indeed, the logins, we had a QR code that the developers could scan that gave them access to a specific account for that round, and either the ServiceNow people walking around or the Platformation people could hand you that login, so we could trace those users as well, the updates that they did.
Nice. Well, thank you for answering my questions. Really, really neat initiative that folks are doing.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think what maybe aside from the people side of things, what we also have, you're probably aware of the platform capability of the instance scan.
Yes.
ServiceNow has built the health scan on top of that, and we at Platformation have our own instance scan sets, so sets of default checks. So the teams work on it. A lot of the things that they have to check for are not manual; they are automated. So we can check business rules for hard-coded sysids. Of course, a lot of the people still use GR as a variable name. We will clean that up. Those details are taken care of, at least flagged automatically, and then will be easily fixed. It keeps track of the issues that were raised, if they were fixed or not, so we can work quite efficiently on finding out those things. But I think still the major thing to check for is architecture is always about doing things right, very important, but also doing the right things. So that's an assessment that, again, also Michelle is key. She is looking, hey, do we agree on the approach? Sometimes a developer during the event said, hey, I have some cool other stuff not captured in a story. We also wanted to facilitate that, because if there's even more added value, why not give it a try? And it ties into I think the last part is because the developers did such a great job and were so enthusiastic. In the last session, we had time left, so we also have a backlog of stories for the future. So that means that if they want to extend the app functionality, we already discussed with a lot of experienced people, hey, these are the next steps. With that foundation platform, you can extend it even further.
That's fantastic.
And maybe to return the question, because you said you have experience in citizen developer as well. Hearing the things that we have done, is there anything you maybe would have done differently, or maybe beforehand would have expected it to be done differently?
No, I mean, I don't think so. Some of what you're talking about is quite familiar to me. We certainly do use the instance scan, and we also have added to our instance scans with custom scans that we've developed. Things like look for GR as a variable name. I don't know if that was one of the out-of-the-box ones. And we also review all the development work that's been submitted or created in the platform. So for me particularly, I look at not update sets necessarily, but it's the customer updates table. So it's the sys_update_XML list. That's kind of one of my favorites. I keep an eye on it to see what's happening in the platform, not just for the scoped app that I might be reviewing, but everything that's essentially being added to the platform. And the other thing is I look through the sys metadata table for that particular scope. And my method typically is to group things by type. Right. So I can look at all the business rules that have been created, all the client scripts, all the UI policies. I look at each group at a time, and I'm looking, based on what it is I'm looking for different things.
Yeah. Sys metadata is indeed one of the things we also looked for. When I said we had an idea of where we would expect the changes to be. That's indeed you group the sys metadata on. Okay, I expect here a business rule should be created, and then hey, it's not a business rule, and then figuring out where it was. Then it sometimes helps. Okay, in which time slot was it? Which entities were touched?
Yeah, sure.
And I can imagine because you're of course doing this not in a hackathon style environment. What are some of the things that you see that we've done differently, right? I said this is an organized chaos, and probably we set the guide rails a bit more loosely because we wanted a lot of fun and creativity. But in a business environment, of course, you still want the guide rails to be as loose as they can. But I can imagine that's a bit stricter than the way we have set it up. Can you share a bit on how you would set up the guide rails? What would you allow? What kind of control mechanisms would you, maybe manual actions you would require?
So, I mean, some of the guardrails include things like running it through instance scans. But one of the differences is that you have you have the high level design, whereas for me and the Ask Registrar app, the high level design wasn't made by me. It was made by the pro citizen developers, because they're closest to their business and they knew what the business needed. So when I review, I look at the table structures, and I provide feedback on whether or not that could be improved, normalized data. I look for things like repeated queries, right? If it's not as performant as it should be, because I want folks to be in the habit of, even if because ServiceNow is a pretty powerful platform, sometimes the difference really is negligible to the end user, whether you've got 2 queries or 3 queries or 1. But over time, that adds up. If everything has 3 queries where you could have used 1, and you keep doing that, then that adds up over time, and so we don't want to do that. So I look for essentially those things, and I provide feedback. And thankfully, the partnership between central IT and the citizen developers are very good in my environment right now. And so they're always very receptive to learning and to changing things based on kind of feedback and best practices.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, especially what you said about almost the shorter term impact that is maybe less noticeable, and then keeping track of the longevity and the sustainability of the platform, right? And I think that's especially challenging if maybe not with the pro citizen developers, but if you talk to more business geared citizen developers, I can imagine that longevity of code, of performing of software is not in their day-to-day business. And then saying, no, because it impacts performance, where the experience from them is it doesn't impact performance yet.
Yes.
That might be an interesting conversation, right? And I think looking at Ashters and Droef, they work at Nationale Nederlanden. That's also where they make the distinction between indeed pro citizen developers, and then I think 1 or 2 additional layers of sort of citizen developers, because there's no one citizen developer, and having at least some foundational training, some foundational understanding, I think that's also key. And it's, of course, something we couldn't influence during the hackathon.
Yeah, so that was also one of the key differences, is that because I do work with known pro-citizen developers, when I find kind of an issue or something that needs a little bit of tweaking, changing, feedback, I can give that back to the developers to do, whereas you had to kind of tweak the code that was, or the configurations that was submitted yourself. It wasn't going back to the developers.
We still make that distinction between a sort of a pro developer, and I would just sit next to them and say, hey, if you would do it a different way, thinking about performance, how can we tweak this? Having that conversation on that level. And sometimes there were developers that were way smarter than me, so they can come up with a lot more things to improve the performance than I could ever dream of. And then you have the really the inexperienced developers. Yeah, then sometimes you can explain a bit while adjusting and showing them this is how I would do it. This is why I'm making these changes and making those changes together with them. And of course, when that was not possible, would do it separately. But what I would like to do during the event was most of the time level with them on the level of understanding that they have and show them either the changes that they need to make or guide them through, hey, I am changing this for you. And that they at least to some level understood, okay, this is what's changed, that they still have that ownership of their piece of the app.
That's fantastic. And I think you bring up a good point that I want to highlight is that when people talk about citizen developers, I don't know if they realize that there are different levels of citizen developers, and you can have multiple levels in an organization, right? Again, like me, I work with pro code developers right now. And so I can provide feedback, send it back to them, and they can make the change. Whereas I do have a few, and they don't work very often in the platform, but more low code. They do catalog builder and flows and things like that. And in that case, we might take more of the approach that you had where I would, correct or make the tweaks to the flow or the catalog item and kind of show that individual, this is why we're tweaking it. This is what we're doing, just for that educational and awareness piece.